wanted to let you know that the materials for the build project in this video were purchased using the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. Thank you, patrons! If you'd like to see me do more environmentally friendly projects like this one, feel free to go check out my Patreon site, linked down in the video description. A few weeks ago, I talked to you about some ways you could make your backyard a better home for wildlife. One of the suggestions in that video was to make a compost pile. I've been composting my entire life, and when I was 16, I even took a class on composting. So today, let's build a compost pile together. But first, why should you compost? You may have heard this statement from the UN before. If food waste were a country, it would be the third highest emitter of greenhouse gases. Well, let's break that down a little bit. Food waste is, as you might imagine, food, parts of food, or byproducts from food processing, like rinds, cores, bones, shells, etc. While most food waste occurs during the production and processing of food products, each of us in our homes is responsible for a portion of the food waste problem. And while any food waste will contribute to carbon emissions and other environmental problems through the wastage of water and other resources used to grow food, when we waste food on our homes at the end of the process, we contribute quite a bit to the carbon emissions of food waste through the additional wasted energies used in food processing and transportation. Ever forgotten meat in the freezer and then threw it out because of freezer burn? Ever ambitiously bought some exciting new vegetable and then never learned how to cook it so it started to rot in your fridge? Ever bought a whole pineapple and then threw the top, core, and peel in the garbage? Each of those is an example of household food waste. And in the second and third examples, the waste could have been rendered much less harmful with the implementation of a compost pile. Composting is a way to recycle or recoup some of the water and nutrients invested in the food production process, and therefore offset the greenhouse gas emissions of food waste. It's also a great way for you to turn the food waste from your household into nutritious, beautiful soil for your home gardens. First, you'll need something to put your compost pile in. There are lots of options at hardware stores, including plastic crates and barrels that you can turn. I tried one of the plastic crates, but it was really flimsy and just fell apart after a few years. If your yard has a lot of cover or space between you and other homes, you might be able to get away with some chicken wire wrapped around 4 posts like my parents and grandparents did. But here in the more populated suburbs, we decided to make our own, more visually appealing compost crate. We bought pine boards and cut them ourselves to make a box that will be 3 feet on each side and 3 feet tall. Next, we attached the slats to the support posts at intervals with screws, then assembled the 4 sides into a crate. I covered every surface of the crate with 2 layers of a waterproofing finish to help the wood last longer, since it'll be out here in the sun, rain, and snow. Well, I've got this nice looking compost crate in my backyard now, so what do I put in it? Before we fill this with anything, we should talk about how composting works. Pardon me for nerding out, but decomposition is one of my all-time favorite topics. Rotting is performed by microorganisms in a low or no oxygen environment, or what we would call an anaerobic process. Without oxygen, the microbes that facilitate rotting produce a lot of stinky smelling chemical byproducts. I don't want that in my yard. Conversely, composting is a decomposition process that happens aerobically, or with oxygen, and is facilitated by both microbes and invertebrates like insects and worms. Decomposition with oxygen doesn't smell at all, or it smells like fresh soil. That's what we want. So how do we make sure there's oxygenated decomposition happening in our compost pile and not rotting? You have to follow the compost recipe. First, here's a quick list of ingredients that should not go in your compost pile. Meat and bones, because they'll attract scavenging animals and smell terrible, and fecal material, especially if the compost is going to be used on vegetable gardens. What ingredients can go in your compost pile? Basically everything else. Some people like to describe the 2 groups of compost ingredients as greens and browns, but I prefer to say wets and dries. Wets are things like bits of fruits and vegetables, coffee grounds and tea leaves, and other damp organic material. Dries are things like fall leaves, grass clippings, and eggshells. If you want to get really fancy, you can put a lot of effort into making sure your compost pile has alternating layers of wets and dries. dries, but I usually just try to put in a fairly even proportion of the two. What you're looking for is a compost pile that's wet enough for microbes to survive, but dry enough to allow some air circulation to promote aerobic decomposition. Another way to promote with oxygen decomposition is to turn your compost pile. I would recommend using a pitchfork or shovel to turn your pile at least twice a year to mix things up and add oxygen. Turning your compost also helps redistribute heat because all of that microbial activity can make things hot inside your compost pile. Depending on how much material you put in your compost pile and how regularly you care for it, you could harvest fresh compost soil within a year or two of starting your pile. I like to put fresh compost in my vegetable garden when I turn it over in the spring, so the new soil gets mixed in nicely. I'd also like to mention that there are ways to compost even if you don't have a backyard. A quick internet search will return composting companies in most major US cities, so you can start composting even if you live in a high-rise apartment. So have you been convinced? Are you going to start composting? I'd love to answer any other questions you might have down in the comments. If you liked this video, don't forget to like it. If you didn't like this video, please share it with someone who would. And if you'd like to support the Roving Naturalist, remember to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon. Then go check out my Patreon page. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.